Welcome to this episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Fuz Rana. I'm a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined in studio today by Dr. Hugh Ross, an astronomer, a Christian apologist, and the founder of Reasons to Believe, which is the organization that sponsors this program. Thanks to generous donations and gifts by viewers and listeners like you. Today we're going to be talking about two discoveries at the frontiers of science that both demonstrate the idea of human exceptionalism and can be used to make a scientific case that human beings uniquely bear God's image. You don't want to miss it. Well, Hugh, good to see you again in studio. Sometimes we have such busy lives here at the office that we don't end up seeing each other much, except when we're in the studio together.
True, but I heard a rumor you're going to do something on human exceptionalism. So I went into the literature and says, I'm going to find something that will complement what Fuz is going to share about.
Oh, good.
And this was published on June 25th, so just a few days ago in Science Advances.
Okay.
And I read the paper and said, this could have been published decades ago. And I know you got 10 grandchildren, so it's like you could have come up with this. And so the paper is basically saying the way adult humans communicate with their infants is radically different than the way the great apes communicate with their infants. And so what this team did is they did field experiments. They watched people like you engaging your grandchildren when they're infants, and they watched chimpanzees and monkeys and gorillas as they engage their infants. And they noticed something that you as a grandfather probably already said, hey, this is a no-brainer. But they got the funding to do this. And what they notice is that when we adults communicate with infants that we're related to, we use a completely different communication system. So the voice that we use, it's a different tone. Our inflections are different. We talk about engaging our infants with baby talk. It's like, we're adults. Shouldn't we be trying to talk to our children with adults so they know how to communicate with adults? But none of us does that. We actually use a totally different verbal, tonal communication system with the infants. Moreover, our hand gestures are different. Our sign language is different. So a completely different way of communicating with infants than we do with one another. Now, this actually helps the infant because the infant is surrounded by adults. And so the infant knows when they're being addressed because they can distinguish the difference.
Oh, interesting.
So, we unconsciously as adults do this because we're trying to get the attention of the infant. So we develop a different communication system. But the infant really benefits because they hear all this adult chatter and they can immediately pick out, okay, this is something I need to be paying attention to.
Interesting.
So, and then when they looked at the great apes, the different species of great apes in the wild, they also looked at them when they're in, human type habitats, zoos and things. And they noticed that the adults don't do that. They're basically using the same communication. Of course, their tools are a lot more limited than ours, but they couldn't discern a difference between the way they communicate with one another as adults and the way they communicate with their infants. The other thing they noticed in the field experiments is that adults communicating with their infants, the infant is getting an incredible amount of communication. Whereas with these great apes, they're getting very minimal communication. And so the human infant is getting orders of magnitude more communication, of course, far more complex, but the volume of communication is orders of magnitude greater than we see. The other thing they notice in the experiments is that when adults are communicating with their infants, they're communicating with them not just what's going on in real time, but they're talking about what happened in the past, what's going to happen in the future. And so this is helping the infant realize, okay, there's a difference between present, past, and future. Whereas you look at the great apes, it's all about the present. And so, and of course, we humans have the kind of brain that enables us to project back into the past and forward into the future that's unique to humanity. But it's interesting that training begins even when the infant is just a few weeks old to a few months old. It's there right at the beginning. The other thing you've probably noticed as you've engaged your grandkids is sometimes you're engaging them with what I would call reality, and sometimes it's fantasy. So like, I did that with our boys when they were infants. You read a book to them, but it's a fantasy book. And so what's happening is that infant, even before they know how to talk, are beginning to distinguish the difference between reality and fantasy. Now, this wasn't in the paper, but I've been doing a lot of study on fantasy because I see that in apologetics, how we often fail to distinguish. We're looking at ancient cultures, what is their fantasy literature and what is their literature on real science. And we can confuse the two. But I've also been reading papers making the point that when we engage in fantasy, it's not just a waste of time. I mean, we humans spend an inordinate amount of time with fantasy, looking at movies, reading novels. We tell stories to one another. We tell jokes to one another that have no bearing in reality. But what all this is doing, research is showing, it's basically equipping us and training us to be creative. It enhances our reasoning ability. It's one of the reasons why humans, unlike the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, or Homo erectus, were able to rapidly launch technology. Our technology rapidly advances. And we look at these great apes, they don't engage in fantasy. We don't see any evidence that Neanderthals ever engaged in fantasy.
Right.
We humans spend an inordinate amount of time in fantasy. And it's not just a waste. Where we say, hey, we could be doing gardening. We could go out and do hunting. That would much better benefit our survival. Instead, we're telling stories to our infants that are completely fantastical. But the payoff is it actually trains our brain to be more imaginative, more creative, our reasoning capabilities. And that's why we've been able to send men to the moon.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the bottom line of this paper, is that this directed communication, this is called a discovery. I think you probably discovered it years ago with your first grandchild. But I think it took the field experiments for them to see how markedly different it is between us and all other species of life here on planet Earth. So I see this as another breakthrough on establishing the biblical doctrine of human exceptionalism and how God designed us so that we could be the rulers over the planet, the managers over the planet for our benefit and the benefit of all of their life.
Yeah. Well, I think a point that you're making is really worth emphasizing, and that is, as humans, we have this capacity for symbolism where we represent the world with symbols, but it goes far beyond that, because once we have that set of symbols, we are able to combine them and recombine them in a near infinite number of ways, and that allows us to tell stories, to create narratives, to establish cause and effect relationships. And this idea that we have this capacity for mental time travel is really significant because with the ability to create narratives, mental time travel allows us to, as Thomas Suddendorf says, to invent our future, that we understand cause and effect, we envision what we want the future to be, and that we can literally take steps to create or literally create goals that would lead us stepwise towards that particular type of future at the exclusion of other futures where through cause and effect we realize would not be as beneficial for us. That's a remarkable capacity that we have that no other animal has, right, at all, that capacity for mental time travel.
Right. And, our symbolic capability, as you point out, enables us to launch this fantasy.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember when my boys first learned how to talk, and, at night when they were going to bed, I'd read a story to them. Very quickly, they said, "Dad, put the book down. We want you to invent a story." And so this went on for years, where every night I had to come up with a story, a fantasy story. And the ones I loved best of all were I tell a story about two young boys and the animals they got to engage.
Yeah.
But every night it had to be a different animal, a different story.
Yeah.
And my wife was saying, hey, this has been going on for 3 years. Are you going to run out? But what that did is it trained my sons to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah.
It's quite a challenge to come up with kind of a
Yeah.
short story on the spur of the moment. And so within a few seconds, and this is something only humans can do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We are obsessed with storytelling. And, I think to your point, the payoff is in the distant future. And so we are, in a sense, through engaging in fantasy, in storytelling, we are sacrificing our immediate survival in order to promote greater survivability in the future. Because the time that we spend doing these types of things, while it does spur on our imagination and our creativity, it keeps, we're not hunting, we're not, gathering food.
Well, we're both scientists. I think we can both testify to the fact that, this has a benefit when you're in the lab
Yeah.
and you're stuck with a problem, you're trying to figure out how to solve it.
Yeah.
All that time that you spent
Yeah.
in fantasy and storytelling, it pays off
Yeah.
at that very moment.
Yeah.
So,
But leading up to that payoff, there's actually a sacrifice.
yes.
So this is, again, part of, I think, what makes us exceptional as humans is that we can recognize that payoff in the future by being disciplined now or engaging in activities now.
That's a good point, Fuz. Another unique feature of human beings, we will sacrifice in the present for something that has a payoff in the distant future.
Yeah.
No other animal does that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's remarkable that the evidence for human exceptionalism mounts, and with it, this idea that human beings really are made in God's image uniquely, as Scripture teaches, which is the foundation of the gospel, ultimately.
Well, I think there's also an exhortation in this paper, is that as parents and grandparents, it's important to invest significant time in communicating with your infants, because it's really going to pay off not only for their benefit, but for our benefit.
Yeah.
So don't let that opportunity slip by.
Yeah. Okay, Hugh, anything else?
No, that'll do it. I want to hear what you got to share.
Well,
So,
my the discovery also relates to the whole question of human exceptionalism, but it is in light of maybe not the great apes as you're looking at with your discovery, but in light of our relationship to Neanderthals, or how are we different from Neanderthals? Because, our perspective at Reasons to Believe is that Adam and Eve were anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, and that all of their descendants, which would be all of humanity, are anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. And our view, remarkably, is rather unusual compared to a number of other
it's a minority view.
Christian apologists. People like Bill Craig argues that Neanderthals were just like humans, that we bore God's image, and because he takes at least a limited evolutionary view of humanity, it means that if humans and Neanderthals both bear God's image and they are, according to the evolutionary model, on different evolutionary branches, that means their common ancestor must have too bore God's image, which would be Homo heidelbergensis. So he places Adam at almost 1 million years ago, 750,000 to 1 million years ago, where we would say Adam appears with the appearance of modern humans. Young Earth creationists oftentimes would argue that any member of the genus Homo is a descendant of Adam and Eve. That would include Homo erectus, Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and they again would argue that they were just like us. And so our perspective is that Neanderthals were not image bearers, and because of that, they weren't like us.
Right.
There's going to be clear biological differences, as well as clear behavioral differences that reflects the presence or the absence of of the image of God. And so there's a discovery that I want to talk about that actually, I think, reinforces the idea that humans and Neanderthals really are different, and that our model is legitimate, but ultimately that, again, humans are exceptional, and that exceptional nature aligns with the image of God concept. And what I want to talk about is a disease condition that is remarkably prevalent, though I've never heard of it prior to reading this paper, and that's called a Chiari malformation type 1. And this is basically a skull malformation that's a developmental disorder that occurs in somewhere between 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100 people. And in fact, the scientist who discovered this is named Hans Chiari, discovered it in 1891 or something like this. And there's actually different degrees of malformation. Type 1 is a rather common one. Type 2 is associated with spina bifida, and there's very rare types 3 and types 4 that I'm not quite sure I know what they are. But this malformation involves having an underdeveloped occipital area of the skull, which is the posterior inferior area of your skull, that is not only reduced in size, but that occipital area becomes relatively flattened compared to a normal individual. The net effect of that is that you've reduced brain area for the brain to occupy, which then forces the cerebrum, or at least part of the cerebrum, into the foramen magnum, which is the opening at the base of your skull that receives the spinal cord. And that puts the portion of the brain in direct contact with the spinal cord. Now, there are people that are completely asymptomatic that have this malformation. Other people that have it might have chronic headaches or might have sleep apnea, scoliosis, or even limb numbness. And so the severity of this can vary. It's usually, more of I would call it a nuisance condition than something that's serious like, type 2, which involves, again, spina bifida. But it is a rather common occurrence. And
it's all based on the fact that there's a bit of variety in the shape of our skull, the back shape of the skull.
Right. So
that's what's causing it.
The technical description of this is that our skull shape is asynchronous with our brain shape. And as a result of that, the brain isn't accommodated by the skull, and it's forced, again, through the foramen magnum. Now, so people understand, what is the medical basis of Chiari malformation type 1, but there's interest in what is the fundamental cause of this. It's clearly a congenital issue. And so in 2013, actually, I've got a couple of slides here. One just shows the reduced brain volume for somebody with type 1 Chiari malformation. And this slide shows the portion of the cerebrum being forced into the spinal cord.
When you talk about shrinkage, how much are we talking about? Like 1%?
No, it's about 7 or 8% difference.
Okay, so it's pretty significant.
Yeah, it's significant enough that it does force a portion of the brain into the foramen magnum. But in 2013, a team from Brazil suggested that perhaps this Chiari type 1 malformation is due to human Neanderthal interbreeding, where there are Neanderthal genes that are introduced in the human genome that actually alter ever slightly the shape of the skull. And what they noted is that people, just through observation, that people with the Chiari type 1 malformation have a posterior and inferior region of their skull that resembles that of Neanderthals. So they speculated that perhaps there was interbreeding where certain genes from the Neanderthal genome were introduced in the human population. But they weren't able to test that idea. So recently, in a paper published in a journal, and here's an image of the paper title,
What's the journal?
It's called Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health.
Okay.
And so this is a paper that will be published. It's accepted. It's an accepted manuscript. And so what you get is a preprint of the
Right.
manuscript. But they actually did a test to determine if this hypothesis was valid. And they used a technique called geometric morphometrics, which essentially means they're creating these three-dimensional images of skulls, and then they can use three-dimensional statistics to determine statistical differences in shape. So that's, geometric morphometrics. Morph means shape. And it's actually a technique that's becoming more and more commonplace among anthropology. And so what they did in the initial study is they compared, using this technique, people with normal skulls, people with Chiari type 1 malformations, and showed that indeed this analysis identifies significant differences in skull shape in the occipital area of the skull. They then incorporated...
Now, we're talking like a couple of standard deviations from the normal variation of skull shape?
Yeah, I don't have the data handy, but they essentially are doing these, principal component analysis, and then they're doing these PCA
I just want to know
plots.
if they had a 5 sigma result or
Yeah,
not.
no, it's essentially what they're doing is plotting out multidimensional data and then showing clusters, and then you can develop the statistics in terms of what samples cluster distinctly from others. But I don't know what the statistical differences off the top of my head, but you can see from their graphs very clear clusters. And particularly, and you can analyze the principal components and determine what's causing the clustering. And so those principal components show that it's, again, the occipital area. They then incorporated into their analysis skulls from Homo erectus, from Homo heidelbergensis, and from Neanderthals. And what they showed is that statistically, people with the Chiari type 1 malformation have skulls that cluster with Neanderthal skulls. And again, those principal components are ones that are corresponding to the occipital area
and
of the skull.
Did they do statistical analysis on the Neanderthal skulls, like the degree of variation?
I don't think they had enough data to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in a sense, they're incorporating the Neanderthal and the Homo erectus and the Homo heidelbergensis samples into their larger analysis.
So they're trying to get enough data.
Right. So you don't probably have enough skulls available to actually do robust statistics, but you can incorporate those in to see where do they actually cluster. Interestingly enough, Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis didn't cluster with the people with type 1 Chiari malformation, but Neanderthals did. Now, this is significant because, again, in our model, we would argue that humans and Neanderthals are different. And there's data that scientifically that supports fundamental differences between humans and Neanderthals in terms of our biology and our behavior.
Even our anatomy.
Yeah. So from a gross and anatomical standpoint, our skulls are globular, our face is flat, our chin is retracted. Neanderthals had a face that jutted outward, and the skulls were elongated. And this actually has different impact in terms of brain shapes, where our brain shape has an expanded parietal lobe and temporal lobe, and that allows for areas of the brain to be expanded that are involved in things like language and mathematics and artistic expression. And so on that basis alone, it doesn't appear as if Neanderthals would have symbolic capability and that they would likely be cognitively inferior. We have the Neanderthal genomes, we have the Denisovan genomes, and we have, of course, modern human genomes. And when we compare them, we see for both Neanderthals and Denisovans differences in a limited number of genes, but some of the genes that are different are genes that are involved in neural development, cognitive development. They're implicated in neuropsychiatric disorders, but some of them also are genes that are involved in regulating brain shape, right? And so, so this suggests again, biologically there are differences, and from an archaeological record standpoint, there's a debate and dispute as to whether or not Neanderthals possess symbolic capabilities. But I think what cinches the deal is that when we look at the trajectory of technology, and this is a point you were making earlier, we started off with relatively primitive technology, and in short order, we put human beings on the moon because we have, this capacity for symbolism, for creating narratives, right? We were creative. Neanderthals' technology remained largely static. And so this suggests that there's something fundamentally different. And anthropologists who argue for human exceptionalism argue its language capabilities that then lead to all kinds of other capacities like mental time travel and the ability to tell stories. So there are good reasons already to think that humans and Neanderthals are different in a way that supports our model that humans uniquely bear God's image. But this study is reinforcing the idea that there really is differences in skull shape and brain shape, so that when there are these Neanderthal genes that have been introduced into the human genome through interbreeding, that it actually alters at least some of the genes, and nobody knows which ones this is. There are, at least from this study, there are genes that actually influence skull shape and create a mismatch between the human brain shape, the modern human brain shape, and the skull shape, leading to this type 1 Chiari malformation. So this is evidence in support of the hypothesis. There needs to be a lot more work done, more, I would say now, at a detailed genetics level.
Yeah, so they've yet to identify the genes that's responsible.
Right, yeah. So this was just essentially, again, this statistical, three-dimensional statistical analysis of skull shapes, but it suggests that this hypothesis is valid, but in a larger context, it really supports the idea that humans and Neanderthals are different, and we have different brain shapes, and Neanderthals' brain and skull match. Our brain and skull matches, but when you're again having interbreeding taking place, one of the consequences is that you're going to get a mismatch now between the brain and the skull. One of the things that's interesting, and we talked about this on a past episode of Star Cells and God, is that even though there was interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals, there are regions of the human genome where there's no Neanderthal contribution. These are called intergression deserts or Neanderthal gene deserts. And some of those regions actually harbor genes that are playing a role in neural development and cognitive development. So it's almost as if there is this protective mechanism that prevents Neanderthal contributions to
damage the image of God.
To damage the image of God, to undermine our brain structures. And in fact, people argue this could very well be a species boundary between humans and Neanderthals. But it does look like occasionally there can be Neanderthal genes that influence skull formation, at least according to this hypothesis. And that can leads to a disease condition.
God knew that sin was coming. I mean, this is part of creation even before he created anything, because he was bound to create us with strong free wills.
Yeah.
And so, and you look at the very strong injunctions against bestiality in the book of Leviticus.
Yeah.
So it's like God knew that this would be a problem for humanity. But in advance, he designed our genome, our anatomy in such a way that the image of God would be protected, even if this were to happen.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's how I would view it as well. Is that there is a protective mechanism afoot, right?
And we got the evidence for that.
Yeah.
Now.
And so what's interesting is that even though people suffer with this Chiari type 1 malformation, it doesn't compromise their cognitive capacities.
Well, as you point out, the vast majority of people with it don't even know they have it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Or they have rather minor consequences. Hey, question. Has this point been validated by population studies? In other words, say you look at people of sub-Saharan descent. Is this abnormality completely absent in that population, or is it present there as well?
Interesting that you should ask that question, because the researchers brought that up as an obvious next step.
So this is the next step they want to do.
Yeah, so
right?
there's some obvious follow-up studies.
Yeah, you want a genetic follow-up and you want a population studies
Yeah,
follow-up.
yeah. But I mean, in a sense, this paper was a really nice study, because they were just simply taking this hypothesis and applying an obvious test to it.
Right.
And now that it looks as if the hypothesis has some merit, now that you can really dig into detail. So it would be interesting to see what comes from this. But again, this again is reinforcing the notion that humans are unique and exceptional. We stand apart compared to the great apes. We stand apart compared to Neanderthals.
Right. I think another interesting third step would be, okay, can we improve the statistics?
Yeah.
Having not read the paper, I'm guessing the statistics has some validity, but I'd be suspicious if it's really strong.
Yeah,
But we can make it stronger by getting more data.
Yeah, well, and here you're limited, because you can clearly do, as much, you can include as many modern humans in the study as you want, as assuming that you have the computational power to handle the statistical analysis. But you're limited in terms of how many Neanderthal skulls you have available, because you need to have, fairly complete skulls, or at least skulls that have the occipital area. And you also have to be certain that they're not damaged or deformed in any way. And you even have a limited number of Heidelbergensis and Homo erectus skulls. So,
well, the last time we were together on the show, you were telling me that they now have a Denisovan skull.
Yes.
That's pretty complete.
Yes.
Did they include that in the study?
No, this was probably work done before people recognized Homo longi.
So that's another step that can be done.
Yes.
Take the one skull you got and see if there's any correlation.
Yeah, that would actually be really interesting to do.
Right.
But, to some degree, there's a limitation. I think that the one of the more productive studies would probably be the population study.
Right.
And I think obviously now you want to go and really look at the genetics and try to determine which genes are playing a role in skull formation. This isn't a trivial thing to do, because as a rule of thumb, each gene is influencing multiple traits, and each trait is influenced by multiple genes. So this is not necessarily a trivial exercise. But if you can at least say, look, these are the places where we see clear genetic differences between humans and Neanderthals, and we know that these genes have been implicated in skull formation, that would be the place to start looking to see, okay, do we see differences where we would expect? And then are these genes now occurring in certain human populations at a higher frequency, or do they occur at a higher frequency in people with, the malformation?
Well, I noticed they published in a medical journal.
Yeah.
So long range, I see another application. If we can really identify the genes, maybe we can genetically correct the more serious implications of this disorder.
Yep.
Like the spina bifida.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the medical insights to this are very important as well.
Right.
Yeah. But again, I think what both of our studies are really showing is that human beings really do stand apart from other creatures in the way the Bible teaches. And when it comes to the image of God, this is the basis for for Christian ethics. It's the basis of the gospel. And it's because humans bear God's image, the incarnation was possible.
Well, something else that strikes me, Fuz, is looking at the scientific literature. It's like every few weeks, there's a paper that makes a case for human exceptionalism from a biblical perspective much stronger. It's like the pace of publications supporting the biblical point. That's what encourages me. Wow. Yeah. There's a lot of people doing research on this, and look what they're producing. And maybe this is going to have an impact on the physical anthropology community.
Yeah.
Because as you and I know, there's not many believers in that community.
Yeah.
And I'm praying that this advancing research could have a significant impact.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't have to be a physical anthropologist to be encouraged by this.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Star Cells and God. We'd love to have you join into the discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video and subscribe for more content. New episodes of Star Cells and God release every Wednesday and are available here on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Be sure to share this video with a friend, and remember, the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe in the triune God of the Bible.